I received an email a few weeks ago that has been sort of sitting with me for a while. And the email was about, from someone who's a regular attender of this congregation who said, I just need a little more hope. I need a little more joy. I need a little more lightness. And my initial reaction to this email was, oh yeah, me too. Like, it's been a rough year, and there's been a lot of stuff. And because we're a congregation that generally tries to put the scripture in conversation with what's happening in the world, it's been sort of a heavy year. Yeah, I get that. And then I thought, there's a scripture coming up from Isaiah in a few weeks, and that's hopeful. And so, all right, we'll get there. Just bear with me. And then I started to wonder about the quality of hope, the quality of hopefulness. And I started wondering, what was not only this person, but a whole bunch of people and part of me meaning? What were we looking for when we said we wanted some hope or lightness or joy or whatever the word is that you use? And I'm not sure if we actually mean hope, as I understand it from the biblical narrative and in the Christian tradition. Because there's a thing about liberals, which I'm in this camp, right? So I'm speaking mostly to myself and maybe to you if it resonates and maybe not to you at all. So take it for what it's worth. Sometimes the liberal passion for justice ridicules this hope word, this quality of hope. Sometimes as liberals, we're so invested in activism and organizing and doing stuff right now that hope gets reduced to urgency, what we must do right now in order to make the world a better place. Or we sort of disembody hope as this ideal that maybe exists somewhere out there. I don't really know what it is. I'm not sure if I believe in it. It exists kind of beyond time and space. So hope is either the urgent now. This thing is driving me crazy, Greg. Hope is reduced to either the urgent now, or it becomes this eternal now. And justice can get reduced to a formula too in the liberal church, where it becomes another ideology, another ism. And when that happens, we stop cultivating transformative hope. Sometimes we get so occupied in issues that we start to rattle off that long list of social ills like racism, sexism, xenophobia, all of the isms that we know really well. And the pulpit is a place to do that from, absolutely, I believe that. But sometimes I wonder if instead of meeting the injustice of the world with the gospel, the liberal church meets it with what is the best of our institutional wisdom: education, reform, intellectualism, and activism. And what happens when we do that, I'm not an organizer. I'm not an activist. There are people who do that work really, really well. And I believe in faith-based organizing and activism, but I am a teacher of Christian history and theology. So from the pulpit this morning, what I think I can talk about related to hope is what I believe is the transformational power of the text that can get lost for us when we stop believing. in the quality of hope that the tradition in Scripture holds. What I mean is there another way to look at the social realities and the dis-ease of the world? Can we speak of injustice and oppression from a different angle? And we can. Because this is the legacy of our tradition and our sacred text, but we have to cultivate the capability of moving and leading from our souls rather than from our head, from our knowledge or our ability or our education. Here's what I don't think hope is. I don't think hope is optimism. I don't think it's a personality trait that we're either born with or not born with. I don't think it's magical thinking. And it's not about saying that everything is going to be okay. Hope, rather, is something more like, as your meditation in the bulletin says from Omid Safi, having one foot rooted in suffering and the other foot rooted in liberation. Hope exists somewhere in that space. And hope as a transformational thing doesn't exist in my head. It exists in the core of my soul. There's no text in the Christian canon that refers to hope as escapism, so I don't know how to be true to the text and tradition by crafting a worship service or a community that gathers to feel better about the world. And I cannot tell you that everything is going to be okay because I don't know if I believe that. What I do believe is that our spirits, as we nurture them, have a unique capacity to answer the place of suffering and hopelessness. The scripture that we heard today from Kathy from the book of Isaiah, it's one that we often hear during Advent. You're familiar with this as the prophecy that comes to us during that season. That's not an entirely great way to use this text because in its historical context, it had nothing to do with the Christ child, nothing to do with Jesus of Nazareth. It belongs to the prophets of the Hebrew scriptures and was talking about someone else, maybe Hezekiah, another king in antiquity. So when we take it out of Isaiah and plop it into Advent to point toward the Christ child, it's not like a large sin. But it's also not very true to the text. Here's what's happening historically. As we've been working through the narrative lectionary, we've been working almost canonically through the timeline of the biblical canon. So we've been through creation, we've been through the destruction and recreation of the world, the Exodus and the people wandering in the wilderness. We sort of have been through the time period of the judges and the kings as Israel is in the process of becoming a nation state, as it's becoming a thing. And we've arrived now at the time of the prophets. And so here's what prophets are in the Hebrew Bible. They're mouthpieces of God. Their message is not their own. They're speaking on behalf of the Lord to the nation of Israel. They're really important to the religious development of Israel. What they're trying to do is keep this small group of folks true and faithful to this religion that they're establishing. All the prophets in the text assert three dominant pieces of Old Testament theology. What does the Old Testament say over and over again? It talks about monotheism. The fact that Israel is carving out space for itself with one God. And not just one God, but a God who has more power than all the other gods. This is part of the Old Testament view of Judaism. They talk about morality, what it means to keep holiness, and they talk about future salvation. Future salvation, which means that despair is not the last word. It's never the final word for the prophets. Their message is always both past and future. It always contains both elements, and it always contains both threat and consolation. So last week, Amber spoke to us from the prophet Amos. Here's what's happening with Amos. Amos exists in a time period where the northern kingdom of Israel is doing really, really well. And this happens with Israel, right? They go up and down in terms of their well-being and success. And throughout this strand of biblical history, you know when they're in covenant with Yahweh because they are doing well. They're flourishing, their land is prospering, they're not being oppressed. When they're out of covenant, they're being oppressed. The land is being destroyed. Bad things are happening. So everything that happens with Israel from that Old Testament theology is seen in context of how they're doing with God. Are they in covenant or are they out of covenant? So in Amos, what was happening was the northern kingdom of Israel was flourishing. They were doing well, and in their wellness, they started to do what people with power and money and success often do. They started to oppress the have-nots. And Amos's call to Israel was, stop it. Fix it, or something bad is going to happen, right? Always about threat and consolation. What's happening in the book of Isaiah is that Israel is being threatened by the Assyrian Empire. And the Assyrian Empire is known for its brutality and its ruthlessness. And in fact, this is not an empty threat because the Assyrian Empire will crush the nation of Israel. It will conquer it. It will destroy the temple. It will force Israel into exile. So the warning is true and will come to pass. But Isaiah is saying this really bad thing is going to happen. And most of Isaiah is a tricky book because as it's put together in our canon, it's not entirely historically accurate or on the straight and narrow. So this text that you have in your bulletin today from Isaiah chapter 9, we really don't know when it was written. And we don't think it belongs quite here, actually. Scholars think this has been placed here sort of out of context. We don't know what the true context for this piece of scripture is, but it could be anything that has happened to the land of Israel during Isaiah's time as a prophet. What's interesting about this, the ambiguity of Isaiah's message, is that it is ultimately one of hope. And it's put into the text as an interruption. It interrupts Isaiah's message of threat with this little piece of consolation, this little piece of hope. That was the former time. There's a latter time. The people who had walked in darkness had seen a great light, and there's a promise of a king, which uses language very familiar to the people of antiquity in the ancient Near Eastern culture. And ultimately, scholars say that something that's interesting about the ambiguity of Isaiah is that it's timeless. Aren't we always living between the former time and the latter time? Isn't that true for all of us, even now? Aren't we always living with both shadow and light? So in a way, this piece of hope that's dropped into a series of threats and destruction narrative is sort of a timeless piece of hope. That period of time that Isaiah is describing, living between the former and the latter, having been in darkness and having this promise of light, this is what a teacher of mine, Parker Palmer, calls the tragic gap. The tragic gap is the gap between what is and what could or should be. So on one side of the gap, that's the harsh, discouraging realities around us, the stuff that is just not going well. And on the other side is the better world that we know is possible, not because of wishful or magical thinking, not because we just wish it were so, but because we've seen it. Because you and I have had experiences of being surrounded by greed, but we've also seen acts of great generosity, haven't we? And we're surrounded by violence, but we have seen people make peace. So it's not wishful thinking. It's something that we know exists because we ourselves have experienced it. And that's what Isaiah is pointing to. Isaiah the prophet says, here you are. Just like the nation of Israel, just like everyone before you and everyone who's come after you, you live in the tragic gap. How will you choose to hold suffering? And before you can figure out how to hold the suffering of the world, you have to figure out how to hold your own. Most of us don't know what to do with our suffering, what exists in the shadow or in the darkness, depending on your translation of that text. What often happens is violence. We are often violent with ourselves or with others when we don't know what to do with our suffering. Sometimes we try to numb the pain of suffering in ways that dishonor our souls, that are very wounding, like noise, or work, or substance abuse. And most of the culture around us tells us that our best option is to settle for what is, right? This is as good as it's going to get for you. So what you should do with the shadow stuff is just ignore it, or bury it, or numb it, stuff it, fill it, cover it up. Find someone who will tell you, oh, it's not that bad. But the problem is that we always live life from the inside out. So whatever it is that exists in the shadow for you, whether you deny it, whatever it is that you deny about yourself or you feel uncomfortable with, that is going to shape your life. In fact, it already has shaped your life. There's a story about a monk who was displeased by the sight of his shadow and his footsteps. Both these things he didn't like. So he determined to get rid of them. And the method he hit upon was that he was going to run away from the shadow and the footsteps. But every time he put his foot down, there was another step. While his shadow kept up with him without the slightest difficulty. And he attributed his failure to the fact that he wasn't running fast enough. So he ran faster and faster without stopping until he dropped dead. What he failed to realize was that if he merely stepped into the shade, his shadow would vanish. And if he sat down and stayed still, there would be no more footsteps. So rather than running from the shadow or ignoring or numbing it, this spiritual life, this life that we're supposed to be cultivating in this space, it's an invitation to stop running. To live from a soul-centric place that seeks wholeness but not perfection. To be here means acknowledging the shadow, your wounds, your failures, your cycles, as well as acknowledging our light, your gifts, and your strengths. But we never live as whole human beings while we're in denial. And I'm willing to bet, because this is true from almost every teacher and practitioner I know, that most of us sitting in this sanctuary have not cultivated the kind of inner life that is necessary to nurture the kind of hope the Scripture describes. Most of us have not walked into the shadow and sat with what we pretend isn't true. Or we do it once and it's really hard and really scary, and so we walk away. Most of us keep denying it as we try to outrun it. But the problem is, like I think Socrates said, wherever we go, there we are. So what does it look like to be people of hope. To understand, first of all, for ourselves, we have to know that we live in the tragic gap. We have lots of choices about how we live there, but that is where we are, every single one of us. If one foot of our self-examined shadow was firmly planted, then my other foot can rest in the light of liberation. And if you aren't willing to live the life that has one foot in your shadow, you might be able to cultivate optimism. I'll give you that. But you will not be able to exercise hope. And when we choose optimism or hopelessness over hope, it's never a reflection of the state of the world, friends. It's never about what is wrong out there in the world. It is always a reflection of the state of our souls. Thomas Merton wrote that most of us live lives of self-impersonation. And I wonder if you, like me, are tired of living that way. I often wonder how long I'm willing to damage my soul by denying what exists in the shadow. To look at that stuff, to examine it, to be with it, not to fix it. Not to fix it. That's not what this is about. It's not about perfection. It's about being aware of it and keeping it out in front of you. If you are willing to acknowledge that stuff, it won't marginalize you. It will be the start of your journey toward wholeness, toward living a life that is fully human, the life that our teacher, Jesus, modeled for us by becoming everything we are, the shadow and the light. Hope is an interruption to the text. It's an interruption to the narrative of Isaiah. And when it appears in the biblical text, it is generally inserted in a disruptive kind of way. If you are willing to begin the inner work, the spiritual journey that you must do in order to live, I guarantee you it will cause disruption. Resting in the shadow requires that you face your own suffering. And yet, it is the only way to liberation. There's an old Jewish tale about a disciple who asks a rabbi, why does the Torah tell us to place these words upon our heart? That's something the Hebrew Bible says over and over in the Torah in different ways. Place the words of God, of Yahweh, upon your heart. Write them there. And the disciple says, why does it not tell us to place the holy words in our heart? And the rabbi answers, it is because as we are, our hearts are closed. We cannot place the holy words in our hearts. So we place them on top of our hearts. And there they stay until one day your heart breaks open and the words fall inside. Thanks be to God.